Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. This week, I have another first. I have my very first guest that is a historian. I have Lindsay Chervinsky. She is a historian, author, speaker. She got her PhD from UC Davis in history, and she is the author of the recent book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. I was really happy to get Lindsay on the podcast as I'm trying to branch out in some other genres. As people may know, I've maybe mentioned on here, I'm a big history buff. I love U.S. history. I love U.S. presidents. I have for a long time. And so I read her book and I reached out, and she was able to come on, and we were able to talk about the contents of the book and just the cabinet and a few other things. So in this conversation, she starts out by telling us why she wrote the book, kind of her intention, what her meaning was behind writing that, and how there really isn't a whole lot of books written on the institution of the cabinet, a created institution, and other cabinets. We talked about how the cabinet is Washington's creation and how that laid the framework for all other cabinets in the future, for future administrations. We talked about the players and the kind of makeup of the initial cabinet. We discussed four major principles that she lays out in the book that Washington used as a general and then transferred to the cabinet. So we talk about those specifically. We talked about how Washington would give homework to cabinet members, have them have responses and questions to come to the meetings that they would have, and to then debate it and dialogue about it. We also kind of took a broad lens and saw how Washington was sort of a first for everything. He was the first president, but he was, doing the first of many things that we now do as a country in the United States pretty regularly. And how he really had in his mind, setting the tone for the position and then future administrations and all of the procedural elements. We talked about the administrative genius of Washington, and then had a small exchange about kind of the comparative legacies that he has with Dwight Eisenhower and Ulysses S. Grant. We talked about how the cabinet was used less in the later half of his second term, and then how this cabinet, this first cabinet, again, set the precedent for every administration to the current president has a cabinet, and how they use them and some of the differences. We talk about some specific presidents and their cabinets. We mentioned FDR's cabinet and what he did, because he had many of them. We talked about Lincoln's cabinet, because there's been a few things written about that. And then we end the conversation talking about the current Biden administration and his cabinet. And so just kind of trailing through, here was the first, and how that creation of Washington's, has gone through the years all the way up even till current day, current administration here in the United States. Lindsay was absolutely lovely. She was, she's obviously very smart. I really enjoyed talking to her, and I think it's great that she's, it's always hard to kind of carve out your place in the world in terms of research or doing studies. And, it's amazing to me still that, people haven't written extensively on the cabinet. It's something that every president has, and that's kind of where she's planted her flag. So this was a great book. Again, I say in the podcast, and I've said it elsewhere, everyone should pick it up and buy it. It's really good, very informative, and looking forward to all of her other work. So now I bring you Lindsay Chervinsky. I am here with Lindsay Chervinsky. Lindsay, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I was chatting about your book and sharing it online, and just kind of fawning over how awesome it was, which it totally is. So of course I'll post links and everything in the notes. So I feel really fortunate that you come to talk about it. So thank you. Really, I appreciate it.
Oh, well, my pleasure. There's nothing better when you spend all that time writing a book than when someone actually enjoys it. So it's a gift to me.
Yeah, I think I had said this to you at one point that um, kind of one of my just personal hobbies is I'm a big history buff, so I read a lot of U.S. history, and this one really stuck out. So I was like, wow, when you read a
Nice.
lot of that stuff, it's just like when something sticks out, it sticks out. So it was real special. So
Well, thank
um,
you.
how long did it take you to write?
So it was initially my dissertation many, many versions ago.
Uh-huh.
So I started graduate school in the fall of 2011,
Hmm.
and I finished in January of 2017. So we'll say like roughly from 2012 to 2020 when I published it.
Oh,
Um, but
wow.
between 2017 and 2020, I rewrote it like 3 times to get it right.
Oh, my
So I don't
goodness.
advocate doing that if people can avoid it.
Wow.
The next one hopefully won't require that many rewrites.
Okay. Do you have something you're working on now?
Yes. So I am, this is kind of putting the cart before the horse, but I am 100% obsessed with cabinets because I've become convinced that they are the most effective and essential way to understanding the presidency and leadership. And they're so often overlooked. And so I'm comparing one of the all-time great cabinets and one of the all-time terrible cabinets, which were
Mhm.
John Adams and Thomas Jefferson.
Mm.
And
Oh, there you go. You're forging
this will,
into some interesting waters there. There's a lot of ink being spilled
yeah.
on those.
Oh, yeah. Well, but that's the fascinating thing is there are so many books on Adams and Jefferson, but most Jefferson scholars don't really look at his presidency because it's kind of, frankly, the most boring part of his public career. And
Mhm,
Adams, most people don't look at his presidency because it's the nadir of his public career. And
mhm.
they really don't look at the cabinets. And
Right.
so it ends up being this incredible story about power and ego and ambition and how presidents manage those things, which actually turns out to be an evergreen story.
Mm. Wow. Yeah, I think Jefferson, I think you're right about that in terms of the administration, from what I've read, is there's obviously Louisiana Purchase, which is like the big thing everyone talks about, which is important. But um, yeah, a lot of his stuff, I believe second term is pretty uneventful. I guess maybe for Jefferson scholars out there, it's like super fascinating. But I think for most folks, it's kind
Well,
of
yeah, I
like,
mean it's his big screw up because he insists upon the embargo, and
mhm.
that goes terribly. And so it's not that people don't write about his presidency, but they sort of, I think, don't look as much at the administration as they should, or they treat sort of the relationships that he had with the cabinet secretaries as de facto or like guaranteed. And my big point is that personal loyalty is not enough,
Mm.
and it requires a lot more attentiveness to manage those relationships, which he really did brilliantly, actually.
I think the last book I read on Jefferson was John Meacham's. Was the one on power? I'm forgetting the
The Art of
title,
Power or something like
something
that.
like that, which was great. It was a great book.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I think it won like all the awards, so that's
yeah,
generally not a bad sign.
yeah, yeah. And Adams is I'm very sympathetic to Adams, so that will be I like his temperament. So
Yeah, me too.
I'll be curious. I'll be curious to read that and see what you find. So
Yeah, me
that'll be
too.
nice.
I'm excited about it. It'll be fun.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess in this way, this book kind of will really introduce people to you in terms of like a nice segue, I guess, from this book and then to something more specific. Although this book really does seem to focus heavily, obviously, on Washington, right? Which I don't know why I didn't think of it that way. When I went into reading it, I was like, oh, I wasn't expecting to get a lot of Washington, but then I was like, oh, there is a lot of Washington here, which makes sense if he created it. So maybe tell us. So you tell us how long it took you to write it and all the rewrites, but what was like your point on writing this, aside from finishing your dissertation? But I guess publishing it to book form and how it is now, and kind of like just give us the overview and the main thesis of it.
Sure. Well, I love that you said that you weren't expecting Washington because I wasn't either. I When I started looking into trying to figure out what I wanted to write about, I knew that I wanted to look at high politics in the early republic, which is sort of like the upper echelon of political officials. But I wasn't totally sure what within that realm. And I started digging around, and my advisor at the time encouraged me to go find books to read about the cabinet, and I couldn't find any.
Hmm.
And I thought, surely that must be a mistake. I must be looking in all the wrong places because surely someone has written this story before.
Right.
And it turns out that they hadn't. The only book that was written was published in 1912, and it was about the legislation that created each department. And I think maybe people just assumed because the cabinet was always there that someone else had done it or it was inevitable. But the cabinet is very much not in the Constitution. And I discovered once I started digging into my materials that Washington didn't actually convene the first cabinet meeting until 2.5 years into his administration. So then I set about trying to figure out where it actually came from and answering that question. And I was not expecting this to be a Washington book. I was expecting it to be a cabinet book.
Mhm.
It just so happens, and this is one of the things that I love about the early republic, is because the administration and the government was brand new and it was so small, each person had such a tremendous impact on the outcome of what happened next.
Yeah.
Their thumbprint on history was extraordinary. And so it ended up becoming a Washington book because Washington created it to suit his needs as president and to provide the advice and support that he required. And so that was sort of an unintentional discovery and not something that I anticipated. And so I love when readers actually reflect that back to me.
Yeah, it was a surprise even reading it. And I think the first chapter is, I was like, okay, is it going to be an overview of Washington? Okay, that's fine. And then I was like, no, wait a minute. Like I saw kind of how you were outlining things. I was like, whoa, like there's a lot of Washington here, which then I guess that when I reflected on the book, I said, well, this is really his, you know, uh, project. Like this is his, special thing. And then reading further and like, it's not really part of the Constitution. It's not like in our first documents and the way it's like, whoa, like you don't think about that. It's just like, yeah, there's a cabinet and everyone picks it and then they have their meetings and it's like all this stuff. And it's like, oh, wait, like that's not, that's not anywhere else. That's just something he needed to figure out to just do his job the best way he wanted to. And so, yeah, it does seem like it's almost like certain things are kind of embodied like from within him. So it's like, this is him. And so like literally each president, the 45 men, right? 45 men. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, you know, have, still kept his kind of like personal project in the beginning. So that's really, really, really cool. Um, so what was your, I guess, main point in writing it aside from just like, well, no one wrote the book, so I'm going to do it. But like, what
Yeah,
was the
well,
other interest?
yeah. So I started off really wanting to emphasize that this wasn't in the Constitution. And so it isn't written down. And when things aren't written down, that means that they tend to be very flexible.
Mm,
And the cabinet is a great example of that. And as you said, every president since Washington has had one, but they all look really different. And each president puts their own stamp on it and kind of creates their own vibe with the department secretaries and figures out how they're going to manage that. And, they have various degrees of success. And so my hope was by, telling the story of how Washington created this institution. First, to show, how much of the origins are still with us, how
mhm,
much of Washington's cabinet is still a very much a presentist or institution,
mhm,
but then also how it sort of laid the framework for so much of the presidency that came afterwards. And one of the things that I think we've all sort of observed in the last several years is that a lot of the presidency is very much based on custom and norm. It's not based on laws or statutes that have been passed by Congress. And it really is up to the person in office following sort of the expectations that have been laid out by their predecessors.
mm,
And the cabinet is such a wonderful example of that and at the heart of all of those things. And so I really wanted people to have a better understanding of our current presidency and the current cabinet and where that comes from. And in some ways, how it was really intentional, and in some ways, sort of accidental.
mhm. Yeah, no, that's great. I guess the first question, one of the first questions I'll ask here on this is, so it's not written down anywhere. I mean, does that technically mean, let's say that, the next president we have or the current president or whomever, if they're like, I just don't want one, don't need to have one. It's within my executive office. I can do what I want with it. I mean, that would be pretty unprecedented. I mean, I know that word gets tossed around, but that would be pretty, the first to not have one or whatever. Like, obviously, people would be like, absolutely not. Like, that's norms and tradition and, whatever. But could, in theory, a president do that?
Well, they would have to have department secretaries
Mhm,
to manage the departments, but there's nothing that says that they have to meet with them.
mhm,
And frankly, there's nothing that says that they even have to take their advice.
mhm.
And, we, without getting into contemporary politics, we did see a fair amount of that in the last administration where
Yeah.
the department secretaries would advise something and then the president would go on Twitter and, announce a new policy. And
Yeah.
that is perfectly within the confines of I mean, maybe, Twitter is not in the Constitution because the framers didn't have any anticipation of that. But that is, perfectly within the chain of command. And so
Yeah.
that's one of the sort of the challenges of this institution is it expects that there is a certain, type of activity and personality that's going to be in this office. And when that's not the case, you get some really interesting results.
Yeah. So I guess maybe we can start with, I guess, the initial cabinet. We'll come back to more current stuff, I'm sure. But there was five men. Well, I guess six, including Washington, right? Or was it five, including him?
Five, including Washington,
That's
although
right. Yeah.
sometimes Tobias Lear was sort of like Washington's chief of staff ish,
Yeah.
and sometimes he would sit in. But there were four men in the cabinet, three department secretaries. So Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, Henry Knox, the Secretary of War, Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of Treasury, and then Edmund Randolph, who was the Attorney General. And there wasn't a department for the Attorney General yet. That didn't come into existence until 1870. But Washington very much treated Edmund Randolph as an equal advisor to the others,
Mm.
which is why I sort of, as a shorthand, just refer to them as the secretaries, because that's kind of how he
Sure.
treated them.
Yeah, and there's some really cool scenes in the book that you kind of depict of they're all huddled in his like office in his home in Mount Vernon, and and by candlelight. And I had this whole visual of like they're in this small room and they're all like arguing with each other about like how to really do the republic and all this stuff. There's some really interesting kinds of scenes. This felt like a really intimate kind of group.
Yeah, it was. And that was really the point. I think Washington created, so once he decided that he needed a cabinet, he basically pulled from all of the best practices that had served him well during the revolution. And he had convened councils of war with the officers before every major strategic decision, before controversial decisions, for lots of different reasons. And that had been really effective for him. And so he replicated that within the presidency. And as you said, they typically met in his private study. Most of the cabinet meetings took place in Philadelphia, which was the
Mhm.
seat of government at the time. And there was a small room on the second floor that was about 15 by 21 feet. It was absolutely stuffed with furniture by contemporary standards because it had sort of multiple purposes. Washington had a giant desk. There were at least three bookcases. He had a dressing table where his enslaved manservant gave him his daily shave and did his hair. He had a globe. There was a stove. I mean, like this room was so uncomfortable by today's standards. And then when you had these four other additional men come in, there probably would have been some sort of small table and chairs for them to sit at. So that's all well and fine, maybe in the winter when you want to preserve body heat and, all of that. But most of the meetings actually took place in the summer.
Yeah.
And, anyone who's spent August in Philadelphia knows what that's like
It's hot.
without air conditioning.
Yeah.
And, by 1793, Hamilton and Jefferson despised each other,
Mm.
truly just hated each other. And were in this room for hours at a time, sometimes 5 times per week. And you can just kind of imagine the horrible atmosphere in this space.
Yeah.
But that was in some ways kind of the point.
Yeah. Yeah. It does seem like this kind of interesting, like feeling of uncomfortability of sorts. And so it's just like, yeah, when I think you had mentioned that in the book that how small it was, I was like, oh God, that sounds miserable.
Oh yeah, it
Um,
would have been absolutely terrible.
oh yeah. Okay. So maybe tell us about, I guess, since this will be kind of germane to further discussions about the cabinet. Washington basically used his, I guess you could say, rubric, if you will, of how he handled himself as a general in the Revolutionary War, um, for making big decisions, and so he basically just adopted that for the presidency. And so there were 4 points. I wrote them down. But, there were 4 points that he did, which were super interesting. You tell me, you correct me, right? It's the War Council. There was the social component, developing an administration system, and then the um, government reforms for independent departments. Is that about right? Did I get that right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep.
So maybe just kind of walk us through some of them. So first and foremost, like, him as general, he had to make wartime decisions. He had to, how is he orchestrating battles? How is he trying to move lines? How is he trying to problem solve in the moment? And so he would have other folks help him out and say, hey, how do we do this, before a big decision. So that was the first thing. It would tell us about, like, how his style was and how he decided to do that, I guess.
Yeah. So one of Washington's greatest strengths was understanding when he didn't know something and when he wasn't good at something, and making sure that he surrounded himself with people that had the skills, knowledge, and expertise to supplement his own abilities. And this was something he did in the war really brilliantly, and then as well as in the presidency. And and he was also really quite brilliant at finding people who were these remarkable candidates and bringing them into his circle and his orbit. So during the war, what that looked like is before, deciding to enter into a battle, before selecting the location for winter quarters, which was a very important strategic decision,
Mhm.
before ordering a potentially controversial retreat, he would convene a council of war with his officers and a lot of the aides to come. He would send out a list of written questions ahead of time to make sure that everyone knew sort of what the topic was and to prepare their thoughts accordingly. He would use that list of questions as the meeting agenda to try and keep everyone on task, because these were not quiet personalities and had their own agendas and ideas about how things should go. And then if they disagreed, and this was really the critical part, he would ask for written opinions. And
Mhm.
the 1-2 punch of having the in person debate and then having the written opinions proved to be essential,
Mhm.
because the in person debate allowed for Washington to basically see all of his options and to allow them to basically poke holes in each other's arguments. And so he
Mhm.
had a really good sense of the strengths and weaknesses of every position. Then the written opinions allowed him to make sure he heard from everyone. So keep in mind, some of these people are particularly loud and, maybe suck up a lot of the oxygen in the room. And maybe not everyone wants to engage in that particular debate every single time. And so if someone was feeling quiet, he heard from them.
Mm.
Or if he wanted to study the details more slowly and privately, he had the opportunity to reflect on the information they were sharing. Because he wasn't particularly fast to make a decision, but then
Mhm.
once he did, he implemented it with
Mhm.
alacrity. So he liked to be able to study and to think and to ponder. And so that 1-2 punch was really quite essential. And he basically took that exact system and he superimposed it onto the presidency and
Mhm.
did the same thing. So he would convene a council, or actually, he would convene a cabinet meeting, not a council of war meeting, a cabinet meeting in the
Right.
presidency anytime there was a big decision that touched on an issue that affected multiple departments. If he couldn't just decide with talking to one person, he would bring them all together. And he did the same thing. He would have a list of questions, use those questions as the agenda, and then request written advice, which, as a historian, I'm particularly grateful for, because that written
Sure.
advice gives us a record that is wonderful. But
Mhm.
it also, again, it worked really well for him. And so when I said earlier that sort of very intense, unpleasant atmosphere was kind of the point, what I meant was that Washington didn't mind when Jefferson and Hamilton were debating and disagreeing and fighting with each other, because he wanted to see how their arguments stacked up against each other. He wanted
Mhm.
to see what was, the weakness in what they had to say. And he wanted the other person to point that out. And so that method worked really well for him. It's just that not everyone likes to be one of the players in that system. And so that's why
Right.
Jefferson ultimately resigned, because he absolutely despised it.
Yeah. But I didn't know any of that either. And so reading the book, I was like, holy shit. Like this, like he was giving them like homework. Like,
Yep,
okay,
totally.
give me your give me your positions. I want you to steel man each other's positions and tell me what it is. And then we're gonna meet and you're gonna, not debate it, but basically we're gonna dialogue pretty intensely about it. And then if they
Yeah,
couldn't find a decision, then go back and write it. And then like there was just so much of like conversation, talking, but then coming with a list of like not prepared remarks, but like prepared questions and how you're thinking about things. And that that was really interesting to me. I was like, well, first knowing he did that in war, and then doing that, again in a cabinet was, utterly fascinating to me. I mean, it just seems so. I mean, I like that way of doing it, but I would never think that's was something that would have been done, which is
yeah,
which
I
is interesting.
I think that I think our sense of Washington's presidency has been sort of skewed by all of the focus on Jefferson and Hamilton. And so we
Yeah.
tend to think that he was kind of sitting back and just allowing them to take care of everything. And that was most definitely not the case. And they also didn't think that was the case. So I mean, they sometimes disagreed with him. Hamilton was, often doing stuff behind Jefferson's back and vice versa. But they all understood that he absolutely called the shots. He was
Yeah.
absolutely in charge.
Yeah.
And if he ordered something, they did it. And I
Hmm.
don't think he would have been a particularly fun boss. He was absolutely a
Hmm.
taskmaster, as you said, lots of homework
Yeah.
and had very demanding expectations. And if people didn't live up to those, was not particularly shy about letting them know. And I think that that works a little bit better in a military setting sometimes.
Hmm.
When when your senior officer gives you a command, you do it. And it's not that they didn't ever follow his command in the executive branch, but I don't think there's quite that same atmosphere of obedience. And so that's maybe where Jefferson had a little bit more trouble with it. But yeah, Washington was much more on top of things and had his fingers and everything than people I think realize.
Yeah. I've always seen Washington as the true independent. Um, I mean, he really just feels that way. And I don't know. You definitely had a great way in writing and even explaining it now of, humanizing Washington, which I know people have tried to do, and that's extremely difficult. But he still has this like enigma around him. It's just this mystique. He's such a towering presence. Um, you
Well, and
know.
that was, so intentional. One of my greatest, sadnesses as a historian was that Washington asked Martha to burn all of their letters when he died, and she complied.
Mm.
Whereas Abigail Adams asked John Adams to do so, and he ignored her. But I think we would have had a much better understanding of who Washington was as a person if that correspondence survived, because I am certain that that's where all the juicy gossip was and
Yeah.
all the details and all the snarky comments. And not that those snarky comments don't exist in other letters, but
Right.
I have no doubt that that would have been the most human of his correspondence. And so we miss something by not having access to that material. But I'm glad that he felt human, because that was really important to me, that he was an extraordinary leader, but he was flawed. He had a
Hmm.
temper. He was thin
Hmm.
skinned. He did not
Hmm.
like being criticized, but he also had a great sense of humor, and he loved dogs and thought that when they did naughty things, he thought it was hysterical. And, so there are real elements to that, which I think are so important, because perfection is not attainable and it is not something that we can replicate. But
Hmm.
if we can say this flawed person, this, very human individual did extraordinary things, what can we learn from that and apply that to our own world? That is so much more
Yeah.
interesting and so much more useful.
Yeah. I think also I think from reading the book was that there's this, and I've felt the same way when reading other books too, but definitely in this one as well, was it was like he had a sense of mm, that he was setting the tone, and that there was like
Mhm.
there's the bigness of everything. Like
Yeah.
this is bigger than me. Like this is I not only am I making, the role of this and shaping and molding it, but it's like, positionally, but also like how does this, you know again set the train on the tracks, kind of, so to speak,
Hmm.
for everyone after me.
Yeah.
And he was, I don't know, there's certain parts in the book where I was like, wow, he's really, you can get this sense that he was really, that was in his head. He was really thinking about that. And it was like, how do I do this in a balanced way that is, you know, is considering all variables and all factors, which again, is kind of speaks to his genius on how he decided to do things.
Yeah, well, I love that you emphasize that point because we tend to think, well, of course, the government, worked out and survived, and the country survived, and it's still here 230 years later, at some points barely, but it is still here.
Right.
And so it's fine. But in the 1790s, there was a real sense when he took office that one misstep would doom the entire project.
Yeah.
And that sounds hyperbolic, but it's not, because actually the Constitution was their second chance. They had created the Articles of Confederation, and
Hmm.
that had failed. And so this was really their last shot. And Washington felt that pressure so much. And I believe firmly he felt it every day. And, it is extraordinarily hard to come up with something from scratch and to do something for the first time when you have no model on how to do it. And
Yeah.
everything he did was for the first time. And that is much less sexy than winning a civil war, winning
Oh
World
yeah.
War II. And so people sometimes, I
Right.
think, overlook what that means to create something from scratch and how truly anxiety provoking that entire decade was.
Yeah.
But I do think, and that's not to glorify them, but I do think it is important to acknowledge the, enormity of that task.
Yeah, there's definitely, you get this sense with Washington. I think probably till election of 1800, and that was obviously has its own issues.
Mhm.
But, there is this kind of fragile state
Yeah,
early on, those first
yeah.
20 years or so, that is really really is going to make it. And I think really after War of 1812, it kind of was okay. But yeah, it's
Yeah,
definitely those early
I would
moments.
put that as the turning point as well, because until then there was this sense that, well, were the European empires kind of waiting in the wings to like pick off sections of the
Right.
country
Right.
and, all of that. And after the War of 1812, I think that fear sort of dissipates. And then they
Yeah.
start getting concerned about a civil war, and rightly so. But um yeah, I mean, it was, that fear was there for a long time.
Yeah, yeah. There was a book I read recently. I want to say it's First Principles. I'm forgetting the name, where it talks about the Romans and the Greeks' influence on the early republic. It's not old; it came out recently. I'm forgetting the author at the moment, but it kind of, when you're saying building from scratch, it's like, well, what were their influences? And it was
Mhm.
a lot of some of the Scottish philosophers, and then it was some of the
Mhm.
Greeks, and especially for Adams and for obviously Jefferson. So their influence was kind of looming over how do we do a republic and stuff. So it was very interesting. So the second point was the social piece, which again, not something I would have thought about. And so kind of the same thing, right? There was a kind of copy paste Washington did of sorts of, you know, socializing, hanging out. How do I build relationships with people I'm
Mhm.
fighting with? And then in the same way, when he was president, you know, how do we, myself, and then with Martha, and then with people in the cabinet, how did they um, kind of socialize with folks in the early beginning? So maybe talk about that point a little bit as well, and why he thought that was important.
Yeah, so I mean, even today, when we think of the presidency, it's not just the political decisions they make, but it's how they interact with citizens. It's how they represent the United States on the world stage, how they welcome people to the United States. And so there is a social presentation element of that office because it is the only office that represents all Americans. And that was 100% true in 1789 as well. And so, again, this was another thing that Washington had to figure out because the social example they had was of monarchy, and that was not appropriate for a republic. And yet, they knew that the foreign ministers who were coming from places like Versailles and the court of St. James to the United States were accustomed to a certain level of glitz and glamour. And if they didn't see that sort of fanciness were they going to respect the new nation? And so
Yeah.
Washington was trying to find a middle ground between building respect for this new nation, both among citizens and people from abroad, but not going too far towards being a king. And that was really hard. And, not always something that I think he felt like he got right or other people felt like he got right. Because if you asked 100 Americans what was the right way to do it, you were going to get 100 different answers.
Hmm.
So there's that component. And then the second component is sort of the esprit de corps within the administration. And this is something that Washington did brilliantly in the war, and where I think the military civilian component most broke down.
Hmm.
And so in the war, Washington was very attentive to the fact that you have to have a good bond between soldiers and officers if they're going to
Right.
fight. Like, this is kind of,
Right.
military warfare 101.
Right.
He was very aware of this. And so in addition to the official meetings and the councils of war, he had regular meals, he had dinners, they went on scenic horseback rides, they hosted visiting dignitaries. But then also during the winter, when they weren't fighting, they invited the wives to camp, and they had holiday balls, and they did all of these social things.
Hmm.
And the point was to build those connections so that when push came to shove, even if you disagreed with what the officer next to you said in the meeting, you still were going to fight with them,
Right.
which makes sense. Kind of standard warfare, as I said. That's a little bit harder in the administration. And Washington really tried to replicate that. So he treated the secretaries as his official family, just like he had treated his aides de camp and his officers. He often invited them to what he called quote unquote family meetings after a meeting or in the middle of a meeting if it was a particularly long discussion. He hoped that if they went to the theater together and they did do these social rides and they had dinners and that kind of thing, that it would allow Hamilton and Jefferson to maintain a relationship even if they disagreed. The problem was Hamilton and Jefferson had such completely opposite worldviews about everything
Yeah.
that there was no amount of socializing that was going to compensate for that. And they began to see the other person as a mortal threat to the republic. And so again, there's no amount of dancing or theater going that is going to overcome a mortal threat.
Right. Right.
And I think also partly that goes to who they were as men and the cultures that they were accustomed to. Hamilton was a military man, and his formative experiences were warfare. And Jefferson's formative experiences were diplomacy and, serving in Paris and in London.
Right.
And that is a very different type of public service. And so I think that their presentations of masculinity, their presentations of what it meant to be an American were so divergent that it was just sort of doomed from the start.
Yeah, I think I mean, of course, again, a bunch of people have written about, Hamilton and Jefferson and all that. And,
Mhm.
it's definitely fascinating. I've always thought that, that their formative years, like you had said, were, I mean, anyone that knows, I mean, most people have seen, the play at this point, but about Hamilton, he was, coming from the islands and, all the stuff with his family. And then like, just as he grew up and just, I mean, he just had a totally different perspective, totally different life, and Jefferson didn't have that. Right.
Yeah.
And then, like you're saying, in public service, very different.
Yeah.
And so I think that well, again, the genius of Washington is he knew he needed both perspectives
Mhm.
because there's a microcosm of how people are going to be different in the new world that they're
Yeah.
building. And how do we entertain that even when it gets
Yeah.
really difficult? And so, um, yeah, I did. It was crazy to me how maybe because they're just people are unified when you have war, but in times of peace, I guess he probably had a harder time with the social component during as president and with the cabinet than he did with war, which is crazy. So yeah, that was an interesting kind of point that I picked up as well. Um,
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, and I think also, it's important to think about when we look at the social component in the war, it is only among the military community.
yeah,
So I don't know, if you had brought in members of Congress regularly, if you brought
mhm,
in sort of other people, I don't know if that same sort of cohesiveness would have been there.
right,
But it was a very homogeneous population, at least in terms of mentality, not necessarily in terms of class or anything else like that. But
right,
And there's no doubt that there was a specific militaristic form of nationalism that came out of military service
Sure.
because so many of the officers went on to serve. A lot of them became Federalists, but so many, the percentage of people in the first federal Congress that served in the military was crazy, just absolutely crazy. So there's
Yeah.
no doubt that there was a sort of unsurprising, but a connection there nonetheless.
Yeah. No, yeah, for sure. And then the third point was him developing the administrative system. Um, and so this kind of goes, I guess, to more of the kind of what we had talked about, like branching towards, okay, well, how does like this is helpful for me, but how do we do the cabinet as a whole, as a kind of thing,
Mhm.
and then how does that work for all the departments and all that? So maybe talk about that third point.
Sure. So it's really important to remember that the department secretaries wore two hats in 1789 and also in 2021. So the first hat is a bureaucratic manager, and that job is the one that is really contained in the Constitution, and it is to oversee whatever department they are responsible for. And in that capacity, they typically work one on one with the president. Typically, those matters do not come before a cabinet meeting or a group decision. And in the 1790s was primarily through written correspondence, and then they would bring that correspondence to Washington and maybe talk about it in person if they had some follow-up questions. The second hat is the advisory one, and is the one that actually brings forth a cabinet meeting and is not supposed to be for every decision. So if Washington convened 99 cabinet meetings in his presidency, he obviously made far more decisions than just 99.
Sure. Yeah.
um, but those are the ones that are big issues, and they're questions of warfare, they're questions of domestic rebellion, they're questions of constitutional precedent, the type of things that it really makes sense to have multiple perspectives on, and that will help Washington make the very best decisions. So that was how he saw his administration of the executive branch. And frankly, to a certain extent, has continued. Good administrations work that way, is you do try and keep things separate because you don't want to have 20 people weighing in on a decision where only one is required.
Right.
And you don't want to only listen to one person when you really do need a lot of different voices. So
Mhm.
that breakdown of responsibilities is sort of a weird part of the cabinet, but is very much central to its existence.
Yeah. And again, you know, I like Washington, but I definitely liked him more after reading this. Just kind of seeing, I had I mean, who doesn't like Washington, right? But I mean, I think there was a part I underlined it in the book about his on this point on the administration. He and maybe it was just him copying him, but reminded me so much of Eisenhower. Eisenhower was like genius isn't even the right word for it, of how he was so good at processes for big scale operations, and like how he like organized our military and made it more modern from where it was, like so many things. And then how he that's how he ran government.
Who
um
else was really good at that?
whom
Grant. There are
yes.
some really weird, I mean, to be expected, but there are some really weird parallels between Washington and Grant and Eisenhower in their presidencies and their cabinets, and there is more to be written there for sure because it is kind of creepy actually when you start digging into it.
It's so funny you mentioned that. I was talking to somebody yesterday online, and we were talking. Yesterday was President's Day, and people were kind of posting, favorite presidents or whatever, and we had my top four, and I put my top four. I wanted to put Grant in there. I really wanted to, but so I put like notable mentions, and somebody says, well, that's a good list, aside from Grant. I said, listen, you don't know about Grant. Let me tell you. Let me tell you, Grant is underrated.
He is.
Underrated. So what he did for Native Americans, what he did for, excising kind of the KKK from, as a group at the
Mhm.
time, Reconstruction. I mean, but then just how he was really instrumental after the failure of Johnson in trying to get us more organized and how he could manage. I mean, just
Yeah.
there's so many amazing things about Grant. And
Well, and the problem with Grant's legacy is that the people who really wrote the first significant bios were of the Dunning School. And
mhm,
for those listeners who don't know, the Dunning School was a group of historians primarily out of Columbia, named after William Dunning, and they were frankly white supremacist
yeah,
historians. They said, Reconstruction and voting rights for African Americans were bad, which is not something that would be tolerable in
right, right,
21st century culture.
right,
And so, because Grant fought for those things, he was therefore bad. And
right,
so, I think that our memory and his legacy was so tarnished by that. And just now, our historians beginning
right.
to really push back on that and say, like, hey, he actually was a pretty great guy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he was the first president that did 2 terms, I think, is since
Jackson, right?
I think that's right. Yeah. That sounds right. Yeah, I think that's
We'll
right.
say it's right for now.
We'll say it's right for now. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Polk had the 1 term, and then everyone died
Yeah.
or got sick or
Yeah.
something,
Or
um,
lost. Yeah.
or lost. I guess technically Lincoln was elected, but didn't finish, obviously. So, but yeah, finished. Elected and finished, and you know, people for a long time, yeah, made all those, like, I would say, ad hominem attacks. Like, he was a drunk and he had these weird habits and he's, squandered his money and, surrounded himself with poor people in the 2nd term, which, again, he did, but I don't think that's a fault to him necessarily. So, anyways, and then, yeah, I guess there's kind of been a renaissance of sorts. Ronald Wright wrote a great book on him.
Yep.
Chernow wrote a great book on him. Brands has written a book on him. So, I'd say the past 15 years, it's been about a handful of really amazing biographies on Grant to try and, recapture his legacy as it is deserved. And so, yeah, I mean, he's great. I really like Grant. So, anyways, but with Eisenhower, same thing. And I don't know, there's the parallel that, they were all um, generals and then they were presidents. So there's something to that. So
Yeah,
it's very
definitely.
interesting though.
That's
Very
a few
decorated generals.
a future book at some point.
Yeah, that someone needs to write that very large, multi-volume parallel analysis on those 3 dudes. Um,
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
so then the fourth one is we got this right, the governmental reforms for the each individual department. So tell us about the fourth point.
Yeah, so this is something that started really and Washington was not instrumental in spearheading this, but certainly was incredibly supportive. So when Congress first was created and first met, starting in 1774 and then through the war, they had sort of a backlash against centralized authority because
Hmm.
they were, fighting the war against king. And so everything was done by committee in Congress. And anyone who has tried to do meetings on committees knows how that went. And they quickly discovered that there are things like foreign policy and finance and managing the war effort that really require more concentrated expertise and authority and the ability to make decisive decisions and then implement them.
Hmm.
But that process took a while, partly because all the different states had different, rules for their delegations, and congressmen were constantly going in and out and sort of cycling in and out. So there was a series of reforms where first they created standing committees, including a committee on committees to reform the committee process, which is never a good sign. But they had standing committees for foreign policy and or foreign affairs and for the war effort. But then even then, they realized that they needed those congressmen were on so many different committees that they had just way too little time. So then they created these separate boards. And so you ended up having a minister of finance, you had a minister that ran the war effort, you had a minister, a foreign a secretary of foreign affairs, and people like John Jay was the first secretary of foreign affairs for the
Hmm.
Confederation Congress. Robert Morris was the minister of finance. And Washington was incredibly supportive of that centralization effort because he was basically on the other end waiting for Congress to provide the supplies and the goods and the money and the authority that he required to actually fight the war. And without those boards, without those committees, without those individuals, he couldn't get anything. And so at one point, there's just a phenomenal letter where he basically says, Congress is asking me to make bricks without straw. And his point is that you cannot win a battle if you don't have guns, or if you don't have ammunition, or if your soldiers don't have shoes in the snow. That's, sort of an apocryphal story, but it's true. They literally didn't have stuff. And so he was saying, like, there is no discussion of strategy that makes sense unless you provide what is necessary for the army. And so he supported that centralization effort. Once there were those ministers, he actually met with them fairly regularly whenever he could. He corresponded with them regularly. And then after the end of the war, he really encouraged the states and Congress to try and create more of a centralized authority, and sent it was his first farewell address. He sent it to the governors of the states, basically urging them to try and create a more centralized power in Congress that could spearhead whatever nation needed.
Yeah.
That obviously didn't come to anything right away. And eventually the Constitutional Convention was organized in 1787, and he sort of reluctantly attended, not because he felt that reform wasn't necessary. He did 100%, but he didn't really want to participate, and had to kind of be dragged kicking and screaming into it. And then, once he was there, was very supportive of a very powerful executive. So while he wasn't necessarily the person writing these reforms, his support for them, his sort of signature on the final letters encouraging them, was really quite essential. And also knowing that he would be the first person in office to wield all this authority was very comforting for Americans, because they felt like they could trust him.
Yeah. Yeah. There's, in all of these points, you really come to see that, a lot of this stuff was, his brilliance. He was shrewd in some ways, but really it was temperament. I mean, that's really how you can see a lot of this stuff, what he's looking for, what his aims are. It was always for the country. Again, the country was in a fragile place because it was so young. And then also there was I guess some people kind of, chat about this in terms of like, well, how much was he looking forward to, like, the future of the country? And I think very much so. I don't think it was just right here, right now. I think it was, this is important for right here, right now. But then also, how do we, again, 100, 200 years from now, how does this hold up? How does this look? And you can see all of that from the beginning. And when you see all of that and dealing with all the big personalities and stuff, it's like, it makes sense why he would want to have, a cabinet to kind of say, how do I can't do all of this by myself. I might be de facto the boss, but how do I need guidance. I need help. I need to bounce this off of people. So again, also something that I didn't know, and probably a lot of people don't know, is that there was the first 2 years where it was just him. So first, the cabinet, or I guess the first cabinet meeting was in November of 17, whatever it was, the
91.
second year, 91. Yeah. um, maybe just talk about that for a little bit. Like, why did it take so long? Or, what was it, just kind of like, how do I get this going? And then there's this period where he used it often. And then I think towards the end of the second term, maybe because he just wanted to get the hell out of there and just didn't, he didn't want to do it as much anymore. But the cabinet meetings definitely trailed off. There wasn't as many. So there's definitely like this kind of like this ramping up, peaks, and then there is a kind of refractionary period. So why did it take 2 years, I guess, as far as you can tell?
Yeah. So this is one of those things where he didn't write down why. And so we really have to piece together based on his actions and some of the other things happening at the time. So because it wasn't in the Constitution, I don't believe that he entered in office intending to create a cabinet. And in fact, he intended to use the advisory options that had been laid out to him in the Constitution, there were two of them. The first was the Senate was supposed to be a council of foreign affairs.
Mm.
Now, of course, that sounds kind of ridiculous today because there are 100 senators, and we would never expect that. But at the time, there were, in the fall of 1789, 89, there were only 22 senators that were seated. And so that's not an impossible number.
Right.
And senators were considered, very safe advisors because they were selected by the state legislatures who would presumably pick the best men. And if the senators gave bad advice, they would remove them. And so Washington really intended for that to be the case. It's just that when he actually went to meet with the Senate, they didn't want to provide that same sort of debate that he had found to be so helpful and that same sort of immediate feedback. And they wanted to talk about it privately in a committee, and then they wanted him to come back the following week. And he recognized that that was a very inefficient process for diplomacy, and diplomacy often requires much more immediate action.
Right.
So that was one option. The second option was in Article 2, it says that the secretaries will give written advice. And initially, Washington did stick to that. But he, again, also realized that that is kind of an inefficient process, especially when you're having to actually write things out with, quill and parchment. And so what he started doing
and then
is
have someone send it by horseback.
Exactly.
Just too long.
Exactly. Yeah, too long. And then, what happens if there are follow-up questions? I mean, this is just a ridiculous process. So what he would start by doing is having, sharing a letter or two, and then have a secretary come and meet with him one-on-one to sort of nail down those other fuzzy details. And that worked for about the first 2 years. He did get advice from some other people. So James Madison was a very close advisor early on, and he was in the House of Representatives, and he was very valuable. John Jay was originally the acting Secretary of Foreign Affairs before Jefferson could take office, and then was the Chief Justice. He was a very good and close advisor. But it wasn't really until some of these bigger issues came to the fore that Washington felt like he needed that sort of group consultation.
Yeah.
And as you said, in late 1791 and 1792, there were only a handful of meetings, and they were usually when big things came up, like when Washington was thinking about asserting executive privilege for the first time. He didn't end up asserting it until later, but he was thinking about it, and that was a big moment, and so he needed to talk to the cabinet. What really spiked the cabinet meetings was France's declaration of war against Great Britain in February of 1793. And that really spiraled into an international conflict. And Washington and the cabinet had to figure out how to stay out of it. And that is actually a very complicated legal question, both domestically and internationally. And so it took lots and lots and lots and lots of meetings in order to try and figure out how to manage all the different pieces of neutrality. And the next year, there was the Whiskey Rebellion. And so Washington had lots and lots of meetings to figure out, how do you handle a domestic rebellion for the first time? There had been other rebellions before he took office, but this was the first one that he was responsible for. And then after that, his initial cast of characters largely resigned or retired and went home. And he had also established several precedents and sort of, I think, trusted his own judgment. But most importantly, I think that he just didn't like the B team as much. They weren't as smart. They weren't as capable. He wrote as much in his letters. I don't think he trusted their advice. And so he did talk to them, but he preferred written advice or one-on-one consultations. And then he also continued to rely on people outside of the administration, like Hamilton. And in doing so, actually left a really critical precedent, which is that the secretaries are not like the British cabinet. They are not a privy council. They do not have equal voting power in decisions. The president makes the decisions, and he can ask for the secretary's advice, and they can give it to him, but he does not have to listen to what they say. And the last couple of years of Washington's presidency really enforced that hierarchy and enforced that the secretaries don't have institutional power in the same way that the British system does.
Yeah, I think that's what large sections of the book kind of talk about, which is, okay, well, let's get the band together, and here's how it happens, and here's what works, and then here's like how they met certain challenges, foreign and domestic. I've always had it's kind of a special place for the Whiskey Rebellion. It's such a fascinating story. It's like, don't tax my whiskey. I mean, that's important, I understand the people's, vehement, opposition to that. but I totally agree with Hamilton. Like, we got to pay our tax, or get the tax to pay our debt and stuff. Like, that's super important. And again, Hamilton's a genius for developing our whole economy in 3 months or whatever.
What's pretty funny is a lot of readers have come away from that chapter and been like, well, did you think that what he did was right? And I was like, does my opinion matter? Like, that's really the point of the chapter is not to say like this was the right, recourse,
right. It
or the
happens.
right choice. It happened. So let's look at why, and let's
Right,
look at how it actually happens.
right,
And you can decide if you think it was the right choice or not, which I think is pretty, people really want me to say if it was like right or wrong. And I'm like, I don't really think that's my job.
Right.
Which I think is really pretty funny.
Well, I mean, yeah, for historians, I mean, you want some sense of neutrality. It's, I guess there's an angle for people that, kind of give more of some opinion there, but it's like, yeah, that's a different type of book, I guess. But yeah, I mean, it happened. It was, again, I find it fascinating. I think it's a very fascinating way. I think it's it's funny because some people say that, Washington really was, deferred more to Hamilton because he sided with him on a lot of things at the end of the day. But, I think that, I don't know how true that is. I don't know what you think, but I don't know how true. I mean, I think that yes, but I think there are pieces or moments where the debate and understanding how it works is the important piece of it. And I think it just happens that Hamilton was more for strong centralized federal government. And I think him and Washington were just more kind of synced up in that way. Jefferson, not that Jefferson wasn't, but again, kind of like you were saying earlier, there's these different ways of viewing the world, which,
Yeah.
I don't think Washington disliked Jefferson at all in terms of how he viewed the world. I think it was, again, going to that. Yeah, we're in a fragile state right now, though. We need to make sure we have like the foundation, the core in place, so that way we don't splinter. That's kind of how I see it. But
Well, what I think is so interesting is we have this sense that Washington always sided with Hamilton because
hmm
that's what Jefferson wrote.
hmm
And Jefferson's narrative of this, because he lived so much longer than the
yeah,
other two,
right.
has really won out. But that's actually not what the evidence shows, because, Hamilton wanted to send in the military in 1792 when the rebels were first starting.
hmm
And Washington made him wait 2 years,
Yeah,
which is, not exactly like a full-throated endorsement. And
right.
when I looked at the cabinet meetings and, those deliberations, Washington sided with Jefferson just as much as he sided with Hamilton,
Mm,
including on some pretty big things. Like the
mm,
first time Washington asserted the presidential veto, it was at Jefferson's suggestion.
mm,
But Jefferson didn't see that and didn't recognize that because he felt like Hamilton had too much power. And so that is what, the historical record has reflected. So I do always think it's, in some ways Hamilton won out because of the financial system,
yeah.
for sure. But, there was a lot that was really Jeffersonian about what Washington ended up doing. And so I always like to point out that, just because Jefferson said it doesn't make it so.
Well, he has a way of words. So.
He does. Beautiful
He
wordsmith,
does.
but
He
often
does.
not a very good, not always the most accurate,
Yes. That,
transcriptionist or
he's a
whatever.
romantic. Or he is. Okay. So, let's for everybody that hasn't already, everyone should buy the book. It's really good. It's a great read. Let's talk lastly about the cabinet afterwards, and we can kind of move to present day. Um, I don't know. I'll ask this. I don't know if you'll give me a straight answer. Do you have a do you have a favorite cabinet from a particular administration? That might be a hard question. Like asking
Um,
who's your favorite
yeah,
cabinet?
it is a hard question. Because I mean, there are sometimes the most interesting ones are the ones that are spectacularly awful.
Mm,
Sort of for obvious reasons. One of the ones that I like talking about the most is actually FDR's cabinet,
mm. Which one?
because exactly, because he basically had like two completely different cabinet strategies.
Mm,
And in the first two terms, he had a very domestic focused,
yeah.
much more progressive cabinet. It definitely encompassed all aspects of the Democratic Party at the time, including the more conservative Southern wing. But
Right.
he did have a lot of progressives. They were very focused on the New Deal. Once he won his third term and the war was looming, he switched out a lot of the key positions, especially with things like Secretary of War, Secretary of Navy, and put in dyed-in-the-wool, hardcore old school conservatives that had served in with Coolidge and Hoover and
Yeah.
had really unimpeachable Republican credentials.
Yeah.
They agreed about nothing relating to the economy. They agreed about nothing relating to social policy, but they agreed about how to prosecute the war effort. And because of that overlap, it ended up being a really effective bipartisan sort of unified government in a way that wouldn't really work at any other time. But that's amazing. And, FDR was one of those people who he didn't care about the cabinet getting along. He didn't care if they were buddies. He frequently played them off of each other all the time. He was very manipulative. He would often give people the same task and see who could come up with like a better, solution. But that worked. And it worked for him. And so I do see, some elements of Washington there. But he was a master politician. And I think that, sometimes people say that is a bad thing, but it worked. It was very effective. So he's definitely one of the ones that I find the most interesting.
Yeah. You made reference to it in the book. And when I got the book, I was like, I wonder if there will be a reference to this, but you had said like something along like, the first team of rivals. So the original team of rivals or something, which of course, that I believe that term was coined by, Goodwin. I think it's her term. So for those that don't know, one of the, probably one of the best historical books in the 21st century is Team of Rivals, Doris Kearns Goodwin, who wrote The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln, and basically said how Lincoln took basically many of the folks that ran against him in the Republican primary and asked them to be in his cabinet and said, look, I need all your opinions, all your ideas. And even though they had some pretty vicious campaigns, namely Seward, who was Secretary of State and thought he was president. So so there's a reference that you make in terms of that, in terms of how, kind of this whole like people not liking each other or pitted against each other or something like that are very contentious. And so I guess as you look at the cabinet and how it evolved, a lot of people didn't do that, right? So Lincoln is kind of the person that did that. I definitely think first term Obama did an element of that for sure.
Well, so I had two goals in the second chapter is called The Original Team of Rivals, which is I'm glad you picked up on that, because at one point a review said like she didn't reference Doris Kearns Goodwin at all. And I was like, did you read the chapter titles? Because that's not particularly subtle.
Right.
But anyway, so, I wanted to acknowledge that because I do think it is really important and it's a question I often get. But I also wanted to emphasize that. So the one area of disagreement that I have with Doris Kearns Goodwin is every president up until Lincoln pulled in their political rivals. That was sort of just how you put together a cabinet. The difference is that Lincoln was the least well-known and the least experienced of all the people in the cabinet, which makes his political genius that much more extraordinary, because he was able to bring these people together into an effective working group. And she tells that story beautifully.
Yeah.
So I wanted to sort of demonstrate that, this was something that was sort of done regularly. And, like in James Monroe's presidency, literally like half of his cabinet was running to be the next president in his second term. So, it was kind of a ridiculous situation.
Quincy Adams was in his cabinet?
He was his Secretary of State, who I think is one of the all-time great secretaries of state.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah.
But like Calhoun and William Crawford, I mean, they were also running against him and were in the cabinet, which is, I think, pretty funny. But yeah, I mean, that concept of team of rivals has been something that presidents have actually regularly gone back to, and they might not fill their entire cabinet with rivals, but presidents will often reward an opponent for bowing out gracefully and endorsing them. Obama did this, of course. Biden appointed Pete Buttigieg to be the transportation secretary, largely because of Buttigieg's really extraordinary campaigning on behalf of Biden once he dropped out. So, I mean, this is sort
especially
of at
the 2-minute warning of the fourth quarter. He definitely he definitely did that pretty well.
Well, and he was like, I mean, his appearances on Fox are like some of the greatest
Oh,
television
that's
ever.
great.
But
Yeah.
I mean, Woodrow Wilson
Hmm.
appointed William Jennings Bryan to be his first Secretary of State. So I mean, this
Yeah.
was sort of a common practice, and it's an important one. It's part of coalition building, and it's one of the opportunities that a cabinet provides to the president, and that they should take advantage of if they can.
Yeah, so I have two final questions. So the first one is, so we talked about this cabinet, Washington's creation. Um, how do you think just overall I mean, we just mentioned kind of the team of rivals thing and all that, but how do you think the cabinet has, this is a very big question, but how do you think it's evolved and how does it maintain through the modern era?
Well, there are certainly some things that are still very similar. So the inherent flexibility of the institution that I mentioned at the beginning is still very much there. And
Mhm.
what that means is that every president gets to decide who their closest advisors are going to be, how they're going to relate to them, what that relationship looks like. And there's very little congressional or public oversight. So that central core element is still the same.
Mm.
The opportunity for coalition building that I mentioned, the opportunity to bring in voices that represent the diversity and breadth of the American experience, that's still all the same. Obviously, it's much larger. It's much more institutionalized. There's a National Security Council. These are things that did not exist in
Right.
1789. And I would argue that as a result, there is some reform that's necessary because I
Mm.
do think that some a little bit more oversight would be welcome. These are people that are supposed to be overseeing the biggest departments that have so much power and authority over our daily lives, and are supposed to be advising the president. And so I think it would be appropriate for there to be a little bit more built-in oversight that doesn't require a subpoena, or
Mm.
isn't subject to um, executive privilege. But
Mm.
you know, that's not really up to me at the moment. I'm happy to talk to them about it if they would like my input, but I have not yet gotten the call from Congress or the president
Well,
just
it's all right. It's just you can still hope.
yeah, there's still time. There's still time.
um, so finally, I'm sure we could, talk for, 2 hours or whatever on this, but I definitely want to know your thoughts on the current administration or cabinet, excuse me, as much as you want to share or talk about. But um, maybe I can. Oh, I can't run through all of them, but we have Blinken, Secretary of State. We have our first female Secretary of Treasury, who I have to say that was probably the one I was absolutely over the moon. The the first female aside, which is super important. I mean, it's crazy, 240 whatever years. Or I guess since the cabinet, 230 some years. That's the first woman. Is pretty awesome. But she's a fucking badass. She is.
she's
She is
she's so
so
experienced. It's
so
unbelievable.
smart, so experienced.
Yeah.
Her job at um, the Federal Reserve, she's brilliant. I absolutely love her. I love her temperament. I love her um, just kind of like her pragmatic aspects. She's wonderful. So I'll I'm fanboying, but so she's Secretary of Treasury, um, Defense. Who's Defense? The first African American. What's it?
Austin.
Yeah, Austin. Yep. You mentioned Buttigieg, transportation. Um, Miguel, somebody for education. Right? You got that right?
Yep. Becerra for Health and Human Services, Deb
That's right.
Hollins for Secretary of the Interior,
Hmm.
um, uh, Nina Tandem for OMB,
Right.
Alejandro Mayorkas for
Homeland Security.
DHS,
Yep.
Avril Haines for Director of National Intelligence. Yeah. Anyway,
AG,
so we could go on and on.
yeah, AG is Garland. So yeah, so anyways, obviously people can look this stuff up, but what do you think about the current cabinet?
Well, so I would say first and foremost, I am over the moon about the return of expertise and competence.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's really actually not. People are going to say that that's a political statement, but it's not. I am glad that there is a Secretary of Education who has worked in education.
Hmm.
That seems to me to be sort of like a basic requirement. And that was not the case in the
Hmm.
previous administration. And so I just think that it is so important that there are people who are experienced and qualified, especially at and then the third point to that I would say is that a lot of them have government experience already.
Right.
And given how the last several years went, and that so many of the departments are really hollowed out of their institutional memory and their institutional knowledge, and the transition was so rocky, that
Mhm.
sort of experience is essential because we're facing, I could name the crises, but pandemic,
Right.
global warming, the economy, structural racism. I mean, like, on and on and on and on.
Yeah, yeah,
Did I say climate change? Climate change,
yeah.
like, so,
You said that, yeah. Right.
so, that is, I think, a very essential first step. There are a couple of choices that I'm particularly thrilled about. I love the choice of Deb Haaland for Secretary of Interior. It is
Yeah, that feels
so
appropriate.
overdue
That feels
to
very
have a
appropriate.
Native American at that
Yeah,
position,
yeah.
and I'm really excited about it. I
Mhm.
love the idea that we have the son of immigrants in the Department of Homeland Security. That just seems to me to be,
Yeah.
someone who can speak to the potential of the American dream and what it can actually do. And let's try and make that a reality in a humane and sensible way is
Mhm.
so smart to me. Um, there are some that I, kind of like about, but I totally get, that are, um, uh, his name, Vilsack is the Secretary of, I think, Agriculture.
Mhm.
It feels a little uninspired, but he's very experienced and did
I
a
was gonna
fine
say
job
he
last
has
time.
a lot of
So
experience with that, so, I mean.
yeah. I would have liked to have seen Martha Fudge there instead of at HUD, the
Mhm.
Department of Housing and Urban Development. So there's some things like that that I'm kind of like meh about. I would have liked to have seen the one area of I think the cabinet did an incredible job of putting together a cabinet that looks like the American people, which he said
Mhm.
he was going to do, and he absolutely met that promise. And that is not just an optics choice, and it's not just a quote unquote woke choice, but it's essential to making sure that the administration actually represents the American people. I think a lot of times people forget that part of
Mhm.
diversity is there for a reason.
Mhm.
That being said, gender parity doesn't necessarily mean equality. And so if
Mhm.
you look at sort of the big national security positions, like the Attorney General, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense,
Mhm.
Director of National Intelligence, CIA, Avril Haines is the Director of National Intelligence, and she's the first woman to do so.
Mhm.
The Deputy Director of the CIA, almost all of those are men, and they're very qualified. I have no doubt they will do a good job.
Yeah.
But I guess I push back a little bit on the like, you know, it's okay to put women in the like domestic spaces, but in the serious jobs, we need dudes. And that is a very at this point that feels like a very small nitpicky thing to say, but I do think long term that will be something to keep an eye on because those positions are traditionally dominated by men. The military is traditionally dominated by men. National security is traditionally dominated by men. And
Mhm.
unless you make a conscious choice to flip that narrative, it doesn't happen by accident. So that will be the one thing that I will look for down the road, and that I would push for in the future.
If I remember correctly, um, the number 2 in defense is a woman? Am I wrong on that?
You are correct.
I
Yes,
think
she's
on
the
that, yeah.
first. She's the first deputy defense director, and the number two at Lisa Monaco is the number two at Department of Justice, which is great. But then it's also like you're going to put women in all the number two positions, and it's like, oh, come on. So
Well,
but again, I
I
am.
will say that for, I think with defense, based on what I know, I could be wrong on this, but typically that's, um, kind of what's the word I'm looking for? A warm up for them getting the position. Not
Mhm.
always, but it definitely
Yeah.
helps, in
No,
case
yeah,
he
I wouldn't
retires
be
or he steps
surprised.
down or,
Yeah.
you think second administration, there's
Yeah.
usually it's uh,
No,
what's the
absolutely. And I wouldn't
warm
be
up? That's
surprised if
the word.
Merrick Garland doesn't want to serve the entire time. If he
Right,
wants to serve for a couple of years, I
right,
wouldn't be surprised about that at all.
right.
And I don't want to, I didn't mention this, but I do think it is really important to say there is clearly a huge problem with white supremacy in the military.
Mhm.
And so I am delighted
Hmm.
that there is a secretary of color. I think that's essential. I'm glad that he is making that a central part. Um, I'm glad that he is making, that a central part of his command of trying to, fix what is clearly a problem with promotion and diversity, especially in the officer corps. So
Yeah.
that is not a small issue and deserves attention. And I'm very hopeful that he will be able to make progress in that regard. So overall, I'm excited about the possibilities. I'm excited about the potential. I worry that I sound like a fangirl for Biden right now, and I've heard some other scholars say this, but like after the last several years, I'm just so excited for normalcy and for boringness that
Yeah.
right now I don't really have any complaints. And I'm sure that I will come up with some down the road. I'm sure that there will be things that I criticize, but right now I'm just
Right.
excited for boring normalness.
Yeah. I agree with you 100%. Mostly because that's how government kind of is. I mean, it
Yeah,
is
it's
when
supposed to be boring.
what one of the things that this is kind of my uh where I focus the lens on is, I'm very much a pragmatic institutionalist. So I like pragmatic institutionalists. I like that stuff. And
Yeah.
so I thought it was really, really, really um, smart in a lot of ways. I mean, people picked on Biden about his age, but Jesus, I mean, there's something to be said when you literally have been in government for 50 years and you've been around for a long time. He knows a few things
Yep.
politically, diplomatically, all the rest.
Yep.
And I think it was he chose, in my view, which made me the most happy, which was a lot of pragmatic centrist, which they know how to work within institutions and with systems. And
Hmm.
that's how I believe we really can get some things done, especially when you have to
Hmm.
work with another party. And while simultaneously saying, hey, there are folks that are women and people of color that are pretty pragmatic, pretty, know how to use institutions. Let's put those people there. We've had a lot of folks that
Yeah.
are, a lot of dudes, nothing wrong with dudes, but we've had a lot of those, a lot of white folks, nothing wrong with white folks, but
Yeah.
there's other pragmatists that are around. The one person I forgot to mention, who again, I'm going to fanboy a little bit. I absolutely adore her. I think she's one of our most awesome public servants is Samantha Power. I was
Mhm.
absolutely excited about her ambassador to was it ambassador to UN? No,
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 she's the US aide.
USA. Excuse me. Yes, USA. Again,
The
that's not
the
like
UN ambassador is also
as
freaking
a
awesome,
yeah,
but,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
But no, to USA, which um, again, I know that is a huge, huge, huge piece that needs a lot of really good restructuring based off of what's been going on the past couple of years, and to really have a good vision and just her experiences and how she has this balance of pragmatism, but then also idealism, and so I think she's perfect for that. So that's also really exciting as well. So I'm with you. I when you
Well,
look
I
at
should also say the one other factor I didn't mention is, when I study cabinets, you can put together the most sterling group of people and check every diversity box and check every box. But if they don't get along and if they don't work together, it does not matter. And
right,
there's nothing that will scuttle an administration faster than the president not getting along with the cabinet secretaries. So I don't fault a president ever for including that as a factor in their decision making
sure,
process because
yeah.
it is so essential.
Yeah. Well, I think the one thing that again some people criticize him about, but Biden took a lot of people from Obama administration, either first or second. So a lot of these people know each other. They know or they know people that have worked with each other, and and so I think that's
Mhm.
also kind of helpful. Like, hey, let's know who how these folks work well with each other, and so I think that's I think that's right. And so yeah, I mean, all that to say, from the first cabinet to the current one, um, you want, I think, especially now though, you want really competent people in all of these departments. And it's a big country. I mean, we're the third
Hmm.
most populous. Um, so many issues, so many things. You want people that are good at uh, running things and how to
Yeah.
organize it and how to deal with it. I mean, you will feel it if you don't at the top have someone that knows kind of what they're doing or have a good sense of that. And so my impression is that all these folks have been um, they're competent in what they're able to do. Um, it does look more like the United States, which I think is always good. And they're very pragmatic and know how to do good change. And so yeah, I really couldn't find too many people I was disappointed with. But maybe it's a recency thing. It's like, well, I was not big on the previous administration's cabinet and all those secretaries. So,
Yeah.
I think but yes, it does seem nice to have some sense of competency there again, or at least to start out. I'm sure everyone will have criticisms at some point. So, the one thing I've
Yeah, of
told people
course.
is, look, let's give Biden at least 6 months to see what's going on.
Yeah.
I mean, like, people sometimes want to judge him like in his first, 2 weeks. And it's like, okay, let's give him half a year. He's got a lot of things on his plate. Let's see what happens. So
Yeah. I like to remind people that in the early 1800s, Congress would hold over its previous session for the inauguration and then go home for 6 months
mm,
and didn't come back into session until the following fall. So literally,
interesting.
presidents could do practically nothing for the first 6 months. So always good to just, take a beat and not rush to judgment and see how
Right.
things go. And yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I know that there will be things that I criticize and I push back on as is appropriate and a
Yeah.
democracy for everyone to do so. But there are a lot of big crises right now. And so good to give a little bit of time and see what they can accomplish.
Yeah. And when I talk to people, I said, I personally I did that for the previous administration. I said, all right, let's see what's going on for 6 months, let's see what's happening. And I think that's good to do, or at least to try to do, and just say, hey, whether you pick the person or you don't like that person, it's not your party. I think it's good to just try and say, well, it's the president for everybody, and let's try and give them 6 months to see if they kind of how they sow the seeds, and see what comes to fruition. But um, well, I have to say, Lindsay, you're quite a delight. You're very
Oh, thank
lovely,
you.
and
This
and
has been
and
really fun.
yeah, I greatly enjoyed it. I again, I love U.S. presidents. I have since I was a kid. I'm a big nerd that way. So this was really awesome to just kind of talk about this stuff and tell people where they can find you and any upcoming things. I know you mentioned the book. So anything else that you want to say about that, or just upcoming projects, and yeah, where they can find you.
Yeah, so the book is available all your favorite places to buy books. Any local bookstore can order it for you, or if you want to go Amazon or any of that route, you can always do that, of course. I am very active on Twitter. That is my favorite social media channel, although I am on the big four, so Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. But Twitter is my favorite.
Mhm.
My handle there is LM Chervinsky. Even if you get it even remotely close, it will find me. I also have a website that kind of brings together all of the work that I do and shares all the op-eds and podcasts and that kind of stuff. And that's just lindsaychervinsky.com. And yeah, the book came out in April. The next one should be out in February 2024 because I like to do things on an election cycle apparently. And until then, I do a lot of public writing. So there's always something new to read if that's your jam.
Yeah, no, that's great. Um, yes, I can't say enough. I've already said it already, but and I was saying it on my Twitter as well. How much I love the book. Everyone should buy it. It's great. It's very fresh. Learned a lot, and yeah. So I hope everyone picks that up. It was very, very awesome to have you on here. I appreciate your time and good conversation. I have to do this again soon.
Yeah, well, thank you again so much for having me. This was fun.
Of course. Thanks.